here. So the topic for today, how to torque any fastener with 100% accuracy without using a torque wrench. So let me set the stage for this a little bit. Have you ever noticed the old techs? They can work on stuff all day long, never use a torque wrench, nothing ever comes loose, and they don't break anything. And that oftentimes they'll refer to that as, their magic elbow or their elbow clicker. Um, I've seen it for years, but the reality is this is deeply rooted in science, and that there are two terms that help describe the behavioral characteristics of it, and it's elasticity and plastic. And it has to do with how an object flexes and returns to its natural state. Anyhow, so I figured we jump in here, talk a little bit about the science, and help to explain why technicians that have been working on stuff for years always seem to be able to torque fasteners right without creating any sort of structural problem to what they're working on. And I had taught at the Votech school level for years before I went on to corporate training. And I've trained thousands of technicians that had no prior experience working on things. And those guys will tear some stuff up. So, especially, and no fault to them. There's learning's difficult. It takes time, that we all go through that arc of learning. I still continuously run through that arc. But anyhow, so with that said, let's jump into this thing. And I'm just going to start to explain some overall characteristics. I think I'll probably start with spring steel and talk about what a single rate spring is, and then talk about some of the deflection characteristics of what happens with this type of material. The reality is that it occurs with all types of materials, but I think spring steel and like a car leaf spring or a coil spring on a car is pretty easy to relate to. Okay, so let's jump into this thing, right? So, and also to kind of stage this here, I am using a writing tablet. I am in Blender. I'm using their 2D animation. So as I start to do all of this, I'm focused on what I'm saying. Can't see what I'm drawing. So if the drawings aren't perfect, just bear with me, please. Okay, so with all that said, let's talk about a single rate spring for a moment. So let's say that here is this coil spring, right? And we're going to say that this coil spring has a spring rate of 100 PS. I warned you guys. Horrible spring, horrible writing. Anyhow, so that spring rate has a rate of 100 pounds per square inch. So if I were to take that coil spring and stretch it out to where it was perfectly straight, and right, because what would happen is that we would have essentially a flat piece of steel. On one end of the steel, it would be fixed where it doesn't move. Let's say we bolted it down or viced it down or something. And on the opposite end of this thing, we could start to apply force to it. And that what that specification means is that if I were to take a 100-pound weight, put it at the end of this steel spring, at 100 pounds, it would bend or deflect this exactly 1 inch. So the spring rate, based on how hard the material is, how long the spring is, right, how thick the spring is, would determine how much force it took in order to move the spring. And this is also assuming that there's no preload, that it's just sitting there static. And I don't want to get into too many different concepts here. I just want to focus on this. So those are the basic mechanics of how a spring works. So I'm going to talk about, and for writing purposes, I'm going to simplify this and just label it E for elasticity. And something that is within an elastic range means that you can deflect it and it will return back to its original point, its exact original point. So with this metal spring, if I were to deflect it 1 inch, pull the weight back off of it, and then let's say that I had some very precise way to measure the height of that relative to something, it would have come back. So elasticity simply means that it's that if you think about the term elastic, you take a rubber band, you stretch it, and it comes back to its original state. So let's explore this a little bit further. What do you think happens to this piece of metal if I bend it 2 inches? Right? Well, it's a single rate spring, meaning that it's the same diameter, same thickness, same hardness of metal, that it would require 200 pounds. Okay, it's pretty obvious, right? What do you think happens if I start to bend this thing 3 inches? You may still be within the elastic point of that material. But like anything, there's going to be a point of diminishing returns. And at some point, you're going to bend this spring so far, this is what will occur. That let's say that I move it 4 inches, right? And ideally, it should require 400 pounds to move it 4 inches at 100 psi, right? But what happens if it only took 350 pounds of force to move it 4 inches? Well, now you're outside of the elastic range and you're within the plastic range of the material. And that you could say that you stretch it, you bend it, you distort it outside of that normal working range. So all fasteners work kind of like this. And bear with me here just a minute, guys. I'm just going to erase this, and that way that our screen isn't quite as dirty. And just kind of talk about this some more. So so if I've got a fastener, and if I start to torque it, right? So we'll say that here's our, and I'm not even going to attempt to draw a hex nut. Just not doing it. That I start to turn this thing with a wrench. And you could also say that based on the diameter of the bolt, how long the bolt is, how much clamping tension it has, that mathematically you could say that it would come out to also have 100 pounds per square inch of deflection. And that what's going to happen is that magic torque, right, this click torque thing, that as I start to turn the bolt, it gets tighter. You bend it a little bit more, it gets proportionally tighter, right? So you move it a little bit more and it gets tighter, but it's not proportional. In other words, you moved it, it got tighter, but the rate of increase wasn't the same. You are at that magical stopping point that you can literally look at any fastener, use this methodology to torque it, and get it within shockingly close to torque specification, right? So So let's talk about what happens if you go past, way past this point, right? So this is what happens with a fastener. It gets tighter, it gets tighter, it gets a little tighter. You moved it, it got a little bit tighter. You stop right freaking there. What happens if you don't realize that's what just occurred and you continue to move it? Well, it goes tighter, tighter, a little tighter, looser, right? And the fastener's over torqued. You distorted it. So you can look at this characteristic in a paper clip really simple. I take this little paper clip, I bend it a little bit, it comes right back. I take the paper clip, I bend it a little bit more, and it comes back. I take the paper clip and I bend it 90 degrees and it stays bent. And then what happens if I take that paper clip, bend it 90 degrees and work it back and forth a few times? You break your paper clip. What you'll find happens with soft metals, they're really forgiving. You can move them from the elastic range into the plastic range and flex them, and that they actually start to work harden, then they fracture, and then they fail. But if you have a tempered piece of steel that molecularly doesn't have a lot of room to move, you'll find that working range is a lot shorter. So like a case hardened bolt, it'll go tighter, 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 a little tighter, and then if you move it just a little bit, it's like snap. Anyhow, guys, there's some of the, without getting crazy into the science, there's a simple explanation to why technicians that have been working on this stuff for years never managed to break anything. And you get the NFG, right? And he breaks off more things in a day than your master tech can probably extract and fix.